Okay, hello again, everybody. So, what I'm going to do, I'm not going to make these videos covering the actual material that you guys have been reading very long because I know you've got a lot of stuff to do and you've read the material anyway. I do encourage you to go look up um, the the stories, like look up the themes and stuff. Contrary to popular belief, things like Cliff Notes and stuff on popular books, most of these will not be on Cliff Notes. For those of you who have already tried, you've already been able to see that. Uh, most of these are not going to be there, but a few in the next 2 weeks will be. Cliff Notes is a good resource to discuss themes, character types, all that kind of stuff. Don't ever use it as a substitute for reading. Use it as an addition to reading. Okay, read the story, then read the Cliff Notes, or read the Cliff Notes and then read the story, and then you'll be amazed at how much it'll kind of open up the thematic elements and the character relationships and interactions and stuff of whatever you're reading. So I encourage you to do some research on your own. Do some Google searches for the books. Read the Wikipedia over the articles. A lot of Wikipedia articles have really good information. Scroll to the bottom, like I've told you in class, and look at the citations. And if they're credible scholarly sources, then you know you're onto something. Okay, it's Wikipedia is a resource that's policed pretty well these days. So I wouldn't ever use that as a substitute for like actual journal articles that are peer reviewed, or books written and published on the material, that kind of thing, and reading the material itself, of course. But again, as an addition to reading and doing other kinds of research, more legitimate quote unquote research, Wikipedia can be a great addition. Excuse me. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the plot of each of the stories that you guys were reading. I'm going to talk about some of the elements that I want you to remember, things that should be sticking out in your mind when you read them, or when you did read them. So I'm just going to go through a list of each work. So for week one of the quarantine, you guys read Riddles in the Dark, which is a chapter from John Ronald Reuel Tolkien's novel, The Hobbit. So you guys probably are familiar with that from having read it as a kid, or seen the Peter Jackson movies, which are totally not as good as the Lord of the Rings movies that he did. But whatever. Digress. But you're probably familiar with the characters of Bilbo Baggins and Gollum, because they've just kind of become memes at this point, basically, right? So in the chapter, not a subtle chapter naming. What happens is they're underground in a cave area and they have a riddle contest. So, riddles, when you see them in literature, they are almost inevitably tests of wit and wisdom and wordcraft skill. How tricky you can be with phrasing things, how wise, how smart you are, that kind of thing. And typically, um, they are a test for or a challenge, right? So riddles and riddle contests and everything date back to ancient Mesopotamia, which is the ancient Middle East, the cradle of civilization, Fertile Crescent, all that, and ancient Greece. And in these stories that were developing in ancient times, they are to test the fitness of somebody to become king, or for somebody to marry whoever they're pursuing, right? Usually, a wise and kind of crafty woman is posing these riddles to a guy who wants to marry her, to see if he's worthy, right? To see if he's intelligent enough to keep up with her. Um, though this is how they're used in literature. Um, in actual real life people stuff, riddles are kind of like folk wisdom. They're passed along from generation to generation, and you're not meant to solve them. Your grandmother's not going to come up to you and say, "I got a riddle for you, try to guess it." She would come up and say, uh, this is the riddle, this is the answer to the riddle, and this is the story that you're supposed to learn from it. And the fact that it's presented to you in the form of a riddle makes it stick in your head, right? We've talked about in class how teaching lessons through stories ensures that people remember them more than if you just told them straight out, brute force, this is what you should and shouldn't do. People remember and they empathize with and they connect with stories more than they do just being told things. And riddles work the same way when it comes to teaching some type of social lesson. Okay, so Trollbridge by Neil Gaiman. I'm not going to talk about the plot of this one. I think it's pretty good. So you guys, have gotten that from reading it. What I want you to remember, though, is the folkloric and mythological origins of the troll creature, right? So a lot of stuff, dragons and trolls and elves and that kind of thing, like we have mentioned in class, call back to this early on when we were talking about the origins of fantastical writing. Most all of these have their beginnings in mythological stories, and trolls are no different. They come from Scandinavian or Norse mythology, right? And what are they? Well, they're creatures that live in little small family units, and they live in rocky areas, they live in mountains, they live in caves, blah blah blah, right? Like the frozen trolls, kind of. They can be ugly and stupid, they can be human looking and smart, or anything in between. Excuse me. Most often, they're dangerous to humans, though in some tellings, especially modern tellings, they can be retellings, they can be helpful to humans. This connects with Tolkien's chapter in that the most popular story that you get with trolls is that they live under a bridge and they challenge you to a riddle contest. And if you win, you get to cross the bridge, and if you lose, they eat you, right? That's how they've developed kind of in more modern European folklore, and that's kind of trickled down into our the way that we remember trolls, right? That's why all the children's books that you get read when you're a kid in kindergarten, before bed, whatever, if they have a troll, it's under a bridge. And to close out week one, we read the Malaysian Myrrh. Again, dating back to ancient Mesopotamia. All three of these readings connect with at least one other in some way, and that's why I group them together for our first quarantine week's fantasy set. Mermaid myths date also back to ancient Mesopotamia. Whenever you have anything dating back to ancient Mesopotamia, you're essentially saying that these types of stories, these types of technologies, these types of rituals, whatever you're talking about, date back to the beginning of human civilization. All humans pretty much originated in Africa, right? And then over time migrated out to other areas. And that's kind of in prehistory. Remember, we talked about different delineations of time, ancient, medieval, and modern history. So when people started writing stuff down, that's when recorded history started, though people had been around a long, long time before that. And people really started developing agriculture, animal domestication, the wheel, writing, trade, government, commerce, organization that extended past clan size, tribe size, that kind of thing. Excuse me, in ancient Mesopotamia, in the ancient Middle East. And so something dates back that long. It's been around since people have been writing stuff down and recording stories to share later on. So, what is a mer? A mer person, a mermaid, typically? Well, they're usually fish women, right? Upper body fish woman, upper body woman, lower body fish, just like Ariel, right? Unlike the Little Mermaid, however, thanks in part to Hans Christian Andersen writing that story, the Little Mermaid gets turned into something less frightening than it used to be. If you remember reading the Odyssey in high school, or when we talked about it briefly, you'll remember the sirens who lure or attempt to lure Odysseus and his men to the shore so that they can kill them, right? Kind of a sexist thing that's been happening throughout history where scary female things try to lure men to their deaths. That's just a thing that keeps popping up over time because, dudes writing stories like to blame stuff on women. Not true, but that's a convention that developed. Um, mer creatures, mermaids were the same thing. They would try to lure sailors over by looking like hot ladies, and then they would drown them and or eat them. So keep that in mind as you're reading this story or having read this story, so you can compare and contrast the folkloric origins of the mer creature with what happens in the story. Okay, week 2, Tower of the Elephant. Robert Howard writing a Conan the Barbarian story. If you've seen the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie from the 80s, you'll kind of notice that it's not a super ton like the short stories here. Conan is like a big, strong guy with a sword who kills a lot of stuff, but he's not stupid by any means. They kind of portrayed Arnold, and this is because getting a little far afield here, but bear with me. This is because Arnold Schwarzenegger at that time didn't speak very good English, like at all, pretty much. And so they kept his lines down. So he kind of comes off as like a big dumb brute in the Conan the Barbarian film. Great movie though. But in the story, he's actually very intelligent. And this is a story in the style of the pulp fiction stories that we talked about from pre-World War II. Specifically a subgenre of fantasy and a subgenre of pulp fiction called sword and sorcery or sword and sandal, where there's elements of magic, there's elements of the supernatural. Main character is usually a big strong person with a sword. Doesn't have to be a man. Some big strong women with swords, Red Sonja, that kind of thing developed out of this tradition. And they go around doing things that were usually too violent to depict in stories at that time. Excuse me. Also, unlike high fantasy stories usually encompass like the fate of the world, right? Like Harry Potter, like the Lord of the Rings, that kind of thing. But sword and sorcery stories are more localized, more intimate, really just dealing with that main character and his or her problems. And again, very pulpy, very in the vein of the Lovecraft story that we read. A lot of cosmic elements sometimes there are in this story once he sees the elephant creature at the top of the tower, and supernatural magical stuff that can't be explained. Just supposed to be exciting, very short, punchy stories that are supposed to keep you interested. It's like the summer blockbuster movie before there was a summer blockbuster movie. And then we did Fall of the House of Usher. Again, probably something that you've read in middle and or high school. I'm not going to get into it. Poe kind of gets done to death in secondary education, so I'm not really going to get into the plot points, but I will point out that this is a type of fantastical literature called the Gothic story, and specifically this is Gothic horror. Usually haunted house, right? People with double personalities or like a doppelganger. There's like a ghost version of somebody who's already alive. There's a lot of mystery. There's a general creepy environment around, like the literal house of Usher, right? It's about the fall of the Usher family, right? The house of Usher, but it's also the literal house, right? And the house is in a really creepy, scary location. This was really popular in the 1800s. People love this stuff. They really liked creepy, weird tales. If there were pulp fiction stories in the 1800s, like in the early 1900s, people would have gone nuts for it. Victorians loved to look down on stuff in public and then just go wild with all this taboo junk in private. Um, if you haven't seen The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix, that's a real gothic story. Watch that when you got nothing else to do and you're home, not trying to get the corona. Okay, that's good show, and it illustrates the elements that I'm talking about very well. Finally, or yeah, finally for week two, we had Dracula's Guest. I can't remember if we talked about Bram Stoker's Dracula. If you were in my monster themed class last semester, then we would have gone over that ad nauseum. Excuse me. Bram Stoker's novel is thought to be missing the very first chapter, and most people kind of agree that Dracula's Guest is the first chapter that's missing from his book. Um, this also is like a supernatural horror thing, kind of subgenre of fantasy. Um, it's got cemeteries, it's got supernatural wolves, it's got mysterious things in it, mystery and mysterious figures in the distance and that kind of stuff. Um, it's we talked about the distinction between like types of horror and how kind of horror has become today a bunch of gore, right? A bunch of blood and dead bodies and heads and guts and all that kind of stuff. Um, to be shocking, basically, right? Because it was taboo to do that, and like we talked about a whole bunch, whole bunch, um, people tend to test the boundaries of what's socially acceptable over time with art and entertainment, both. And so we were like, oh, hey, you couldn't show blood and guts and gore and everything in the 1910s, so now we're going to do that in the 70s and that kind of thing. So that's kind of what's become synonymous with horror. But this is a more creepy kind of psychological dread horror, much like The Color Out of Space. It's not esoteric like that. You know exactly pretty much what's going on. You know Dracula is being creepy and he's a vampire and he's kind of haunting this guy and, you know, is going to try to drink his blood later on. You know that as a reader. But uh, it never really happens, right? Excuse me, yeah, I'm talking too much. I don't have the corona. It doesn't happen, so you're just left in suspense. There's a lot of tension. It's that kind of horror, not jump scare, not blood and guts. Okay, final week, where we jump back to sci-fi on week three. Harpers of Titan. This is kind of a weird one. Main character Captain Future, which is kind of a ridiculous name to us now because things that kind of cliche have been done forever. Okay, this is like a space adventure serial, like used to come on TV a long time ago with characters like Flash Gordon and that kind of thing. Same character type that Indiana Jones is based on. Explorer dude who goes on adventures and finds things, and each episode or each story is self-contained. They don't really relate to one another, right? And pulp fiction in general is a lot like this. And this is a pulpy type story as well. The space adventure serial that the Harpers of Titan is. They go on an adventure. It's wrapped up neatly in a bow by the end of the short story or the end of the episode, and the character goes on and does something else cool the next week or the next magazine publication, whatever. You know, a lot of you probably are old enough to remember that TV kind of used to be like this. Maybe you're old enough. I don't know. But like in the 90s and back, early 2000s, like the sitcom formula, right? Every episode was just its own thing and it didn't really relate specifically to any other episode, right? Now, if you watch a series like Game of Thrones or like Stranger Things or whatever, each episode is going to be connected to the one before it and the one after it, right? They're telling they're like really, really long movies. But before it was just 25 or 30 minutes of its own thing, and then the same characters would show up and do something completely different next time. So in that way, it's like Conan, but in space, right? And then finally, Ender's Game. And I wanted to pick this one because it was a little longer than the rest. It's not the entire thing, I don't think. But Ender's Game is a really good example of what's become super popular in science fiction and kind of has always been in the background. And that's humans having conflict with aliens. And, you know, usually the aliens are like bad, right? So we see things like Starship Troopers, War of the Worlds, Independence Day. You can make the argument more easily in some than others, less easily in Starship Troopers if you've never read that. That the aliens are bad and humans are good and we're fighting self-defense. Okay. That's how it happens in a lot of military science fiction. Well, Ender's Game is kind of different in that it kind of bases its plot around human nature, right? And that we kind of fight and kill each other all the time. That's kind of humans thing. Ever since civilization was around, we've been coming up with more and more elaborate and expensive ways to kill as many of each other as we can all the time. So at the end of Ender's Game, of course, Ender kind of realizes that he's been tricked, and that he's fighting in all of these simulations the whole story. And at the end, they're like, "Oh, it wasn't a civilization. You actually committed genocide against this alien species." And he's like, "Oh crap!" And so they weren't the aggressors. Like, humanity had fought with them. They'd lost. They went back to their own planet. Whatever, they're done. So humanity was like, well, we can't just leave them there, because what if they do crap in the future? So let's murder them all. So it casts some of humanity in a different light than other military science fiction stories do. Though compassion is a main theme of the story, right? Having compassion for other living things. Not only humans. That's a big part of Ender's journey, because this is also a coming of age story, because Ender's a kid, right? He's doing all these things. He's a child. He's a teenager. Or almost a teenager and then a teenager, right? So he's very young. And so because he's very young, the story is also asking you to think about what militarization of a society can do to that society. In this case, they're recruiting child soldiers, basically. Which is a real thing that goes on, a real terrible thing that happens. Adults force children to fight, right? Why? Because children are young and they're easily manipulated, and they haven't developed a conscience fully yet. So in a lot of ways, it doesn't take a whole lot of explaining and coercion to get a child to do something really terrible, because they don't understand what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know the consequences of their actions, and they just want to please whoever's in charge, right? And so people prey on that, and that's kind of what happens in Ender's Game, basically. And it takes it a step further in that Ender doesn't even really know literally what he's doing. He literally doesn't know the consequences, not just kind of like metaphorically and ethically the consequences, but they dupe him into committing genocide without him really knowing what's going on. So that's the 3 weeks worth of stories. I think there were 8 in there. Final video here, I'll talk about the last 4. And then I encourage you to go explore these more. A lot of these have movies. Ender's Game has a movie. Like I said, Conan has a movie. Dracula has like 8 movies. Fall of the House of Usher has a couple too. I think. Of course, The Hobbit, all that kind of stuff. All of the Middle-earth films. So if you want something to do in addition to reading these, go watch them. Compare, contrast. Pretty interesting. Okay, bye.